Hello, welcome to the Hollywood Video Podcast. I'm your host, David Wells, and we're going to talk about movies. What movie today? Well, the 2025 Superman, directed and written by James Gunn, starring David Cornsweet as Superman. So, I really like this movie. And I say that I really like this movie, but my dad really likes this movie. He is not the type of person that will watch a movie multiple times. He saw this movie 3, maybe even 4 times. I think I texted him the day after I saw this, "Oh, you should go see the new Superman movie." And he texted me back, "I'm currently in the theater seeing it for the 3rd time." So that's a testament. He did say of like Man of Steel, he wasn't huge on the story. And this is not going to be a James Gunn versus Zack Snyder thing. We will have to talk about the other Superman movies, but it's not a who did it better thing. There might be a little bit of that, but we're going to try to review the 2025 Superman. So, how did this all start? Well, it started pretty messy. The DC Extended Universe, or the DCEU, had been going on for a couple years, and there were so many course corrections, quote unquote, where new people would come in to Warner Brothers. There were mergers, and even though leadership changed so many times, whether at the top or in sort of the elite circles, the culture of that company still seemed to be a mess. Now, the interesting thing about Warner Brothers is they almost feel like this sort of recovering alcoholic that stumbles back into the habit. Like, they'll get sober for a bit and make really good choices, but then they'll wind up faltering and making horrible mistakes again. So it's like, I know a lot of people decried David Zaslav. I think that's how you say his last name. But I wouldn't be surprised if Warner Brothers problems persist long after him. There's just something in the DNA of that company where, yeah, they'll do really well, then really bad, then really well. It just happens all over the place. So, what was happening at this time? I remember a couple years. So it's 2022. I'm watching that movie Black Adam, and me and my mom go watch it. I enjoyed it. It was pretty good. It felt like kind of like the story structure felt like an 80s movie with modern day filmmaking technology. We stay towards the very end, and Black Adam gets a video message from Amanda Waller, and then Henry Cavill's Superman shows up, and the movie theater is filled with kids, like, who are the primary audience for this. 12-year-old boys who just want to see cool stuff happening. And as soon as Henry Cavill's Superman stepped into the light, they're like, "Oh!" And it was really cool to witness that. And they briefly played John Williams' Superman theme. Now, not a second later, the internet reveals that James Gunn has basically been made Kevin Feige for DC's stuff. Him and a guy named Peter Safran, they're going to be the go-to guys for the DC movie properties. And what do? They they seem to immediately nix any plans of Henry Cavill continuing being Superman. There still may be a couple of DCU projects left over that are going to come out because they have to. They've already spent so much money on them. One of them being the Flash movie, which the star Ezra Miller, he has gotten into so much trouble. The movie almost didn't get released. And Aquaman movie and the Blue Beetle movie, which I haven't seen it, but it looked promising. And I think James Gunn even said it's part of the DCU canon, but it's not our first one. Superman is, which that's a confusing statement, but I don't know. You could probably do a whole podcast on that one statement alone. The sequel to Aquaman, which was actually maybe one of the more profitable films from the DCEU. The sequel, it floundered, pun totally intended. It didn't make its money back, and there's suspicion that Amber Heard's character was removed and replaced with a octopus or something. That just sounds like an episode of South Park right there. And let's see. There really didn't seem to be anything too controversial about Blue Beetle. From what I can tell, it was... I'm going to have to go back and watch it. I didn't get to see it in theaters or any platform. But from what I can gather, people generally found it enjoyable. I think there was a hope that what Black Panther had done for the African American community, they were hoping that Blue Beetle would do the same thing for the Latino community. I don't think that it quite panned out that way, but I haven't heard anything particularly negative about this movie. I just think it didn't do as great as they had hoped, and that could be due to a number of factors, not bringing into question the movie's quality. But anyway, that is the backdrop for the beginning of what is now the DCE. No. That is the backdrop for the origin of the DCU. No E, just the DC universe. So, of course, the question came up, what's going to happen with Superman? And even though James has said that he's not going to be directing every project or even writing every project, for Superman, he needed to put his stamp on this universe. He needed to let people know the flavor of things to come. Even though there were DC projects that preceded it, I haven't looked into it that much. He just wanted to start things off right in the theatrical movie-going experience. So how did James get this job? Well, famously, in the later part of the 2010s, he had this huge controversy for some old tweets that he had made way back when, which he had discounted and said, I was wrong for that. But, Disney fired him anyway. And then after much fan outcry, they decided, we'll give him another shot. He can do Guardians 3. But before that, he did a sequel to Suicide Squad, which did, for the time of COVID, pretty well, both theatrically and on HBO Max. Pretty much everybody agreed that this was an improvement on the first one. And by that, they mean an improvement on the theatrical cut that got released. From what I've heard, there's no bad blood between James Gunn and David Ayer, who directed the first one. And there's even been polite discussion of releasing David Ayer's original cut that he wanted before Warner Brothers stepped in. All things considered, things have been remarkably diplomatic between James Gunn and some of the more significant figures of the previous DC cinematic universe. I guess it's just the fans that like to cause drama and pretend like, oh, they must hate each other. But thankfully, that doesn't seem to be the case. So, getting into Superman 2025, I like this movie. It has a really well-paced story. All the story mechanics worked out perfectly. There were never any moments where I go, hang on, wait, what? Well, why did you do that? And yeah, there's some. I did something which, you know, I probably shouldn't have done. Like, I kind of went into this movie with a roadmap. Um, Kevin Smith, after seeing the movie, he immediately does a podcast afterwards, and he says heavy spoilers, goes into detail about what happens in the movie. Basically, like, says the whole movie. And I watched that knowing that. And so I kind of had a roadmap for this movie, and that didn't sully my experience of it. Um, there weren't any egregious plot holes in this movie or anything that would just take your attention away from what was going on. And there were story beats that they set up, and it feels like they earned those beats. And the biggest thing that they did pretty well was incorporating John Williams' original Superman score from all the way back in the 70s. They did it much better than the 2006 Superman Returns. From what I heard, they actually had John Williams' input about, like, hey, what can we do with this? What would you approve of? What would you say? Don't do that. So that was cool to hear. John Williams did not do the music for it. There were two other composers who they came up with original music, but they drew heavily from John Williams' work, and it shows. In fact, there's this one scene in the movie where Jonathan Kent and Clark are having this heartfelt moment together, and they do this variation of the Superman theme, and I'm in the theaters and I'm getting a little choked up. So that was cool. So this movie, I've heard it's been called corny and cheesy, and that's kind of the point. But another thing that this movie is absolutely and totally sincere. I think one of the things that it gets is it isn't necessarily realistic, but it is believable. And I think we had to get to this point in order to get this movie. Like, the last 25 years would have been a miracle to get to it, but it's a good thing that it took this long. So, brief plot summary of what's going on here. So, there's no origin story. In fact, the movie starts with a big, huge defeat. There's a title scroll talking about, like, takes 2 or 3 minutes, talking about Superman's timeline when he arrived, when he first started doing superhero stuff and when he lost his first battle. So there's the scene of him crashing into the ice in the Arctic, and he's all beat up and bloody, and he whistles, and Krypto shows up. So just seeing Krypto in the trailer for the movie, we knew we were getting something different than Man of Steel. And I love Man of Steel. It is totally possible for you to love James Gunn's Superman and Zack Snyder's. The affection for one is not mutually exclusive. So Krypto takes him to the Fortress of Solitude, and Superman's robot helpers, they have him exposed to the sun with a giant magnifying glass so he gets more of it quicker, and they play footage of his parents, his Kryptonian parents. Jor-El being played by Bradley Cooper, which was a favorite James Gunn. And so they're speaking Kryptonian, and they're saying this message that seems hopeful, but it's not like it seems. So, Superman gets arrested. Well, not totally. Then he has to go fight that same bad guy in Metropolis. And turns out Lex Luthor is behind it. You think it's this giant robot guy, but then it's this dude in a black outfit once the armor gets taken away. And apparently Lex has this pocket universe that he discovered from this reactor. It's deadly, and it could break the fabric of reality. Very typical science fiction comic book stuff. But he doesn't care. He uses it as his own personal prison. And it looks very much like a Guardians of the Galaxy sort of thing. So what happens is Clark is working at the Daily Planet, big shocker there, and it looks like all his coworkers, Jimmy, Lois, they have no clue. But later on, it's revealed that Lois knows Clark's identity. He agrees to do an interview with Superman, and then it gets heated when he's trying to explain his morality to her, and she dumps truckloads of gray on his black and white morality. And unbeknownst to him, Lex tracked the location of the Fortress of Solitude, and he's got a way to get in there. Spoiler alerts. So him and his goons, they hack the computer, they get information, they get the video of his Kryptonian parents, then they broadcast it to the world after Superman and Green Lantern, Hawkgirl, and Mr. Terrific defeat a giant kaiju monster. And he broadcasts this message, which is translated, and it reveals something kind of sinister. Apparently, his Kryptonian parents said, you're going to go to Earth and be this symbol, but Earth people are simple, so you'll have to dominate them and put together a harem and continue the bloodline through as many offspring as possible. And in a way, he's basically, the bad guys basically have every right to be fearful of him. So Superman, he kind of flies away. Everybody's against him. And eventually he meets with Lois, and he's like, that was never my plan. I didn't know that. She's like, I know. And so he makes this plan to go and give himself up, which he does. Then Lex puts him in the pocket dimension, and there's this one character who can create any element, and of course Lex has him create Krypton. Or Kryptonite. And Lex totally, this really proves how ruthless he is. Up until this point, it just has been demonstrated he has a dark streak, but then he takes one of Superman's friends, this guy who ran a falafel stand, and he shoots him in front of Superman. And the elemental guy, he's crying too. And This is a movie where characters really wear their hearts on their sleeves. And yeah, it's just. So, anyway, what happens is eventually Lois gets the help of Mr. Terrific, and they go into the Pocket Universe prison, and they're able to get him out. Then they go back to the ranch, and Clark recovers, and he has this heartfelt moment with his dad, his earthly dad, Jonathan Kent. The scene that kind of got me choked up a bit, and he's reaffirmed of who he is as a person, and it doesn't matter what his Kryptonian parents said, he is who he is. And then trouble starts brewing in Metropolis, and they've got to go save the day. There's this whole subplot between two countries, which some have read as events going on in parts of Europe and parts of the Middle East. But basically, Lex is in with this dictator guy who looks kind of like a Putin stand-in, although with crazy hair. Anyway, they're in cahoots together, and Hawk Girl takes care of him, and Green Lantern holds off the army invading the other country, and the plan is revealed that Lex wanted to carve out part of the occupied country for himself. And later on, it's revealed he wanted to use the resources to build up his wealth so he could destroy Superman. He's very fixated on Superman. So what happens is Superman and Mr. Terrific are able to keep the Pocket Universe from splitting the world in half, and their primary focus is on Metropolis, where where the center of everything that's going on is happening. But before that, Superman fights the guy in the black outfit from earlier, and it's revealed that he's a clone of Superman. Maybe he's going to wind up being Bizarro, but he looks just like Superman. And so, in a way, it's this almost kind of metaphorical way of Superman doing battle with the thing his Kryptonian parents wanted him to be, which Lex believes him to be, and who he truly believes he is. Spoiler alert, he wins. Clone Superman gets sucked into a black hole, and then Mr. Terrific figures out how to close the pocket dimension, and everything is set right. Lex is revealed to be evil. The prisoners in his pocket dimension are set free, and everybody trusts Superman again. And the movie ends with him going back to the Fortress of Solitude, and he gets healed with sun rays. And the first time this happened, they had a message from his Kryptonian parents played while he recovered. This time around, towards the end of the movie, it has him play his earthly parents, like home movies that they shot when he was growing up. So this movie basically got right the strengths of the other movies and fixed their weaknesses. So first off, we're going to start off with the Christopher Reeves movies, comparing it to that. Obviously, we can't lay into this movie too much. It really was like a product of the times, and it did so much that whatever flaws it might have, they're forgivable. This is a time before CGI and all that happened. Is perhaps like 15 years or so before before computer graphics could do anything of any significance. So they did so much with just practical effects and some of the earliest computer-controlled motion cameras and rear projection, all this technology, which, In the wrong hands, it can look super hokey, but if you know what you're doing, they use the tagline in the movie, "You'll believe a man can fly," and you do. But one of the strengths of that movie is the director, Richard Donner, said, "Look, here's how we win people over. We make them fall for the love story between Clark Kent and Lois Lane. If we get that, this movie can't not be a success." So famously, Richard Donner shot Superman Part 1 and Part 2 back to back. They had real confidence in this project. But famously, he was fired from Superman 2, and they brought in Dick Lester, who directed The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night. Now, there was some controversy. Later on, they released the Richard Donner cut, which basically showed why the Superman sequel released all the way back in the day wasn't as good, and it was generally received as a market improvement. There were two other Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and they seemed to, as each movie progressed, they seemed to basically rely on the novelty of the IP, oh, it's a Superman movie, come watch it. And that marked a lesson in the history of superhero movies, that the novelty of IP can only go so far unless you have a good movie. So the biggest thing that we have to, there are a couple things with the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. Number one, it showed us what Superman looked like in a theatrical movie. And what's really interesting is he set the standard of what the aesthetic for Superman looks like in these. I've seen the three most recent incarnations of Superman. My mom sees all of them and she's like, wow, they all look just like Christopher Reeves. And it's like, I think I kind of get what she says, but when you look at each of them individually, it's like, really only Brandon Root kind of looks the most like Christopher Reeves. I think what it is Christopher Reeves set up what Superman looks like. So when people say, oh, he looks just like Christopher Reeve, Henry Cavill is probably the most different looking from all the actors. So I scratched my head a bit when my mom said that he looked just like Christopher Reeves. I think what she means is, oh, they look just like Superman, because they have this aesthetic that basically communicates the quality of what Superman represents. So the Christopher Reeves movies gave us that. They gave us a reference point of what it could look like for Superman to fly in these movies. And of course, we can't not mention John Williams' fantastic score, which leads us into the next iteration. For a long time, there was no Superman movies. There was almost a revival of it back in the 90s, which famously fell through. Tim Burton was going to direct. Kevin Smith wrote a script, and Nick Cage, of all people, was going to play the man from Krypton. That didn't happen. Some say for better, some for worse, but we'll never know. We got a brief glimpse of that in The Flash, where it showed Nick Cage's long-haired Superman battling a giant spider. There's a whole story there. And Kevin Smith said, oh man, it would have worked. But who's to say? This goes into the Brandon Routh Superman from 2006, which was directed by Bryan Singer of X-Men fame. Somewhat of a disgraced figure now, and we haven't heard much from him. But we can't not mention it. So, after the first two X-Men movies came out in the early 2000s, it's funny because the last two Batman movies of the 90s, it seemed to almost put the nail in the coffin for superhero movies. And it's argued that only a couple years later, the X-Men movies 1 and 2 kind of brought them back, and they were quickly followed by others. The early 2000s was really a renaissance for superhero movies. It showed that, like, yes, people want to see these movies, and there's finally the technology to make them really come to life like they should. So Bryan Singer did his 2 X-Men movies, and he was one of the candidates for doing a new Superman movie. And he said all the right things, and Warner Brothers gave him the job. Needless to say, he split with Fox on X-Men, and he didn't do the third one. So his big contribution is he got Brandon Routh, who he really does look quite a bit like Christopher Reeves. It's kind of astounding. And the other thing he did is he relies heavily on the John Williams themes, not quite as elegantly as James Gunn does in 2025, but he still uses it to great effect in the opening title sequences, which are so heavily referenced to the 1970s Richard Donner opening title sequences. I remember my stepmom, she saw that and she got so psyched on that. I wasn't there with her, but she recounted it to me and like, oh, that's cool. So the thing about this movie, it often gets criticized for, and even Bryan Singer himself has says, if he could go back, he would like punch up the action and maybe cut 20 or 30 minutes from it because it is a long movie. If it's not 3 hours, it almost is. There's supposedly audiences didn't like it, critics did, and there's a lot of talking in this movie with brief stints of action. The third act climax is actually pretty cool, but it's just up until this point, just not much has happened. So for that movie, they pretend that like the third and fourth movie from the original Christopher Reeves movies didn't happen, and this is supposed to jump off from that. So Superman has been looking at the ruins of Krypton, and then he comes back to Earth, and stuff has changed. He finds out he winds up finding out he has a son with Lois Lane, and Lex Luthor uses kryptonite to create a giant continent. He lures Superman there, and because it's kryptonite, he seems to beat his thug. His thugs seem to beat Superman, but then Superman basically like musters up strength, lifts the giant Krypton continent, and throws it into space before plummeting to the ocean, gets put in the hospital, and eventually he recovers and flies off. And while him and Lois can't be together, he says he'll always watch over his son. This was the final movie of, shoot, I can't believe I forgot his name. Marlon Brando. They used archival footage from the other Superman movies to have him play Kal-El. So technically this is his last on-screen appearance. So this movie had pretty good human drama, good acting. I wouldn't say there's any bad, cheesy performances. It does feature a pre-scandal Kevin Spacey. He does a pretty good menacing Lex Luthor. He's not cartoony and over the top like Gene Hackman, but no disrespect to Gene Hackman. He was great. But he does his Kevin Spacey, cold, calculating. If you've seen any of his work from House of Cards to Seven, you know what I'm talking about. He brings that to this rendition. So I feel like I would agree with Bryan Singer that maybe cut 20 or 30 minutes. And as I've thought about it recently, I think this movie kind of feels like the last movie of a trilogy that we didn't get to see. Like it feels like the culmination of relationships and events for two Phantom movies that don't exist. I feel like if there had been two other movies that set the stage for all that, maybe we'd have a different experience. And there was talk for a sequel, but Warner Brothers wasn't thrilled with the box office return. It did $400 million globally, but on a $200 million budget, that wasn't enticing enough for them. So yeah, really what this movie needed was like some cool action and fight scenes, and that's exactly what we got about 7 years later with Man of Steel. Um, Man of Steel, I have my own thoughts on Batman versus Superman. The quick summary of Batman versus Superman versus Man of Steel is Man of Steel was very much Chris Nolan's movie. Batman vs. Superman was very much Zack Snyder's movie. So Man of Steel treads similar ground of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. Basically takes the plot of like the first two. Kal-El, Superman's Kryptonian father, is warning Council Krypton, there's seismic activity, the environment's in danger. Krypton is going to die if we don't do something. They're like, oh, that's nothing. And then General Zod comes in. He's like, y'all have betrayed Krypton. And he's leading a coup. He kills some of the members. But then the military intervenes and they take him and his cohorts and put him in the Phantom Zone. Meanwhile, Krypton begins to disintegrate. And the council like, oh my gosh, we should have listened. And Kal or Jor-El is like, well, it's too late for that. So Jor-El and his wife, they send Clark to Earth. And he grows up, and his dad is played by Kevin Costner. He's this movie's Jonathan Kent. So he grows up, and he keeps going around saving people, and we leave him just as quick. And Lois Lane, played by Amy Adams, she's globetrotting looking for him, like, oh, who is this guy? Sort of in a way similar to Batman Begins, we get flashbacks to flesh out Superman's origin. There's this scene at school where it shows how he can... It shows the extremes of his powers, how he reconciles being able to hear everything, and his mom comes and she helps out, and it shows that she helps him to regulate. And then there's a scene where, as a kid, he helps rescue a school bus from a lake, and his dad chastises him because they can't let his secret be known. And then the one scene that rubbed me the wrong way is it shows Superman when he's older, and his dad helps rescue somebody from a tornado, but then he could get rescued by Clark, but his dad says, no, you can't know, and he dies. So General Zod, and so that's something that this Superman has to live with. So fast forward, General Zod and his cronies get out of the Phantom Zone, and they want to turn Earth into the new Krypton. Superman, who's been taken into custody by the military, him and the military then team up, and they stop Zod, or his forces, but his forces get destroyed, and he's like, I don't have Krypton, I don't have my people, I'm gonna destroy Earth. And so him and Superman fight, and then Superman is put between a rock and a hard place. In order to keep Zod from killing two Earthlings, he has to snap his neck, and that's what a lot of people got lost on that movie. Zack Snyder wanted to do something bold. He may have gone a bit too far, but it did set up for the next movie. Movie ends with Superman taking out one of the US's drones, and he says to like the head of the military, "I'm just gonna have to learn to trust me." So the coolest thing this movie did was it gave us all the cool, awesome fight scenes that were sorely missing from the 2006 Superman Returns. The movie's biggest flaw, I don't count the darkness, and the gritty takes. I mean, just about every movie after 9/11 had to be dark and gritty, and they were all a far cry from the sort of camp and cheese of 90s superhero movies. I think the lesson that it seemed we had learned after 9/11 was that even before, although there were brief glimmers of the exception to this rule, the rule was that dark, gritty, and real were equative with believable. I think what we were looking for was believability, but given the times, believability and dark and gritty and real were conflated. So it took us a while to learn that wasn't the case. And so I wouldn't say that Man of Steel suffers from that, but it was a product of its time. 9/11 had only been 12 years at that point. So we were still, its imprint was hugely felt. So it took a while before we got to the James Gunn 2025. And I think that the 2025 James Gunn Superman couldn't have happened in a pre-COVID time, because COVID kind of was almost like the hitting rock bottom, to where we had fallen so hard that all we could do is look up. And what was in the sky wasn't a bird, wasn't a plane, it was Superman. And I think that's why the message of being optimistic in a world that's anything but resonated so hard. And that's one of the key things that movie did so well. It had all the cool action, had the personal human drama, and it had the optimism. And all of those movies had it in some way or fashion, but this is the one where it just really landed really well. Well, this has been the Hollywood Video Podcast. Take two. This has been the Hollywood Video Podcast. I'm your host, David Wells. Go watch a movie. Go make one if you're so daring. And I hope all your dreams come true. Have a good night. Bye.